A storm was rolling in, the kind that turned the sky into an endless swirl of gray and sent shivers down your spine before the first drop of rain ever fell. The air was thick with the promise of chaos, and every sound, every gust of wind, every distant rumble of thunder felt like a warning. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a boy and his horse were out there, alone, far from the safety of home. They had no idea how quickly everything would spiral out of control. The boy wasn't much older than 14, and his horse, a sleek, dark-coated mare with a streak of white running down her nose, had been his constant companion for years. They'd grown up together, exploring the woods and open fields, inseparable even on the most ordinary days. But this wasn't an ordinary day. This was the kind of storm that changed everything. It started like any other afternoon. The boy had ridden out to check on the far side of the family's property, where the trees grew thick and the paths were more like whispers in the underbrush. He loved that part of the land, the way it felt wild and untouched. The horse seemed to love it too, her ears twitching with every new sound, her steps light and eager. They hadn't noticed the sky darkening behind them or the way the wind had begun to shift, colder and more urgent. By the time the first clap of thunder rolled across the hills, they were already deep in the woods. The horse stopped abruptly, her ears flicking back as if she knew before the boy did that something wasn't right. He patted her neck, trying to reassure her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they needed to turn back. Fast. The wind picked up, tearing through the trees and scattering leaves like confetti. Branches creaked and groaned, some snapping and falling in sharp cracks that made the horse flinch. The boy tugged on the reins, urging her to move, but she hesitated, her hooves digging into the soft earth. She wasn't just nervous, she was scared. And the boy? He was starting to feel it too. Rain came next, sudden and heavy, drenching them both in seconds. The boy pulled his jacket tighter around him, but it was no use. The water seeped through, cold and relentless. He leaned forward, speaking softly to the horse, trying to keep her calm as they made their way back toward the trail they'd come in on. Or at least, he thought it was the trail. The storm had turned everything around them into a blur, and the once familiar landmarks now felt like strangers in the chaos. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the storm only grew worse. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in sharp, fleeting flashes. Each time, the boy caught glimpses of his surroundings, trees bending under the force of the wind, the ground turning to slick mud beneath them. He tried to stay focused, to keep his mind clear, but the fear was creeping in. What if they were heading in the wrong direction? What if they couldn't find their way back? The horse suddenly stopped again, her nostrils flaring and her body trembling beneath him. The boy followed her gaze, squinting through the rain, but all he could see were shadows and shifting shapes. He called out, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. No answer. Just the wind and the rain and the pounding of his own heartbeat. He urged the horse forward, but she wouldn't budge. Instead, she let out a sharp, nervous whinny, her hooves stomping against the ground. Something was out there. Something neither of them could see, but both of them could feel. The boy's grip on the reins tightened, his knuckles white. He didn't know what to do, stay and face whatever was ahead, or turn and risk getting even more lost. Then, out of nowhere, a deafening crack echoed through the forest. The boy barely had time to react before a tree came crashing down, its massive trunk slamming into the ground just feet away from where they stood. The impact sent shockwaves through the earth, and the horse reared up, her eyes wide with terror. The boy held on as tightly as he could, his heart racing, his mind scrambling for a plan. But there was no plan. Not yet. Just survival. The storm wasn't letting up. If anything, it was getting worse, the rain falling harder, the wind howling louder, the forest closing in around them like a living, breathing thing. The boy took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't ready to give up, not on himself, not on his horse. Together, they stood there, two small figures against the wrath of nature, searching for a way out. A way to safety. A way to survive. But in that moment, the way forward was anything but clear. The boy's hands shook as he tightened his grip on the reins. His breath was ragged, shallow, like he couldn't quite get enough air. The horse's flanks quivered beneath him, her fear seeping into his own. He whispered to her again, soft and low, though his voice cracked on the words. "It's okay. We're okay." But neither of them believed it. Not really. The fallen tree had ripped open part of the forest, leaving behind a mess of splintered branches and tangled roots that blocked their path. It had been so close, too close. The boy's mind raced, trying to remember the way back, but the rain had turned everything into an endless, shifting gray. The trail was gone, swallowed by mud and water, and the trees loomed like dark towers, their shapes bending and twisting in the storm. The boy urged the horse to turn, guiding her around the wreckage. She hesitated but eventually obeyed, her steps slow and cautious. He could feel her muscles tense with every movement, her head jerking at every sound. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance, and she froze again, her ears pinned back. The boy didn't move. He just listened, his heart thundering in his chest. For a moment, there was nothing but the storm, the rain pounding against the leaves, the wind tearing through the trees, the distant growl of thunder. Then, faintly, he heard it, a low, almost guttural sound that made his skin crawl. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was something else. The horse shifted beneath him, restless, and he knew they couldn't stay there. Whatever was out there, he didn't want to find out. Not like this. He nudged her forward again, guiding her through the maze of trees and fallen branches. The ground was slippery, the mud sucking at her hooves, but she kept moving, her trust in him outweighing her fear. The boy didn't know how long they'd been wandering. Time felt strange, stretched thin by the storm and the constant sense of danger. His clothes were soaked through, his hands numb from the cold, and his stomach ached with hunger. But he couldn't think about that. He couldn't think about anything except putting one foot in front of the other, one step closer to safety. As they moved deeper into the woods, the boy's mind began to drift. He thought about his family, about the warmth of the kitchen and the sound of his mother's laughter. He thought about his father's steady hands, the way he always seemed to know what to do, no matter how bad things got. He thought about the horse's stall, clean and dry and filled with fresh hay. He thought about how none of that mattered if they didn't make it back. The horse stumbled, her hoof catching on something hidden beneath the mud. She let out a sharp cry, and the boy nearly lost his balance, his hands fumbling with the reins. He slid off her back, landing in the muck with a wet thud. His knees hit the ground hard, and pain shot up his legs, but he ignored it. He scrambled to his feet, his hands already moving to check the horse's leg. She stood there, trembling, her head bowed low. Her breathing was heavy, uneven, and the boy could see the whites of her eyes. "Easy, girl," he said, his voice shaking. "It's okay. Let me see." He ran his hands along her leg, searching for any sign of injury. His fingers brushed against something sharp, and he pulled back with a hiss. A jagged piece of wood was lodged in her hoof, the edges splintered and slick with blood. The sight of it made his stomach twist, but he didn't have time to panic. The boy dug into his pocket, pulling out the small knife he always carried with him. His hands were trembling so badly it took him 3 tries to open it. He knelt in the mud, using one hand to steady the horse and the other to carefully work the wood free. She flinched, her whole body jerking, but she didn't pull away. "Almost there," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or himself. Finally, the piece of wood came loose, and the boy tossed it aside. Blood welled up from the wound, dark and thick, and he tore off a strip of his shirt to wrap around her hoof. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He tied it as tightly as he could, hoping it would hold until they found help. The horse nuzzled his shoulder, her breath warm against his cold skin. He leaned into her, pressing his forehead against her neck. "We'll get through this," he said, though his voice was barely a whisper. "We have to." They started moving again, the boy walking beside her now, his hand resting on her neck. The rain had slowed, but the wind still howled, and the trees still creaked and groaned around them. Every step felt like a battle, the mud pulling at their feet, the cold seeping into their bones. But they kept going. The boy's mind wandered again, this time to the stories his grandfather used to tell him. Stories about storms and survival, about people who had faced impossible odds and come out the other side stronger. He'd always thought those stories were just that, stories. But now, in the heart of the storm, they felt like something more. He thought about the way his grandfather's eyes would light up as he spoke, the way his voice would rise and fall with the rhythm of the tale. "You're stronger than you think," he'd say. "Sometimes you don't know it until you have to be." The boy wasn't sure if he believed that. Not yet. But he wanted to. The sound came again, that low, guttural noise that had haunted them earlier. This time, it was closer. The boy froze, his breath catching in his throat. The horse stopped too, her ears flicking back, her body tense. They stood there, silent and still, listening. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the distant rumble of thunder. But beneath it all, that noise lingered, steady and menacing. The boy's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the darkness, his eyes straining to see through the rain and shadows. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he could feel it. Whatever it was watching them. Waiting. He tightened his grip on the reins, his other hand reaching for the knife in his pocket. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The horse shifted beside him, her hooves stomping against the ground, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The boy took a step forward, then another, his eyes never leaving the shadows. He didn't know what he was walking toward, but he couldn't just stand there. He couldn't let the fear win. But as he moved, the noise stopped. The forest fell silent, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl and your heart race. The boy's breath was loud in his ears, his pulse pounding like a drum. He didn't know what was worse, the sound or the silence. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the noise came back. Closer this time. Louder. The boy turned, his eyes wide, his grip on the reins tightening. The horse let out a panicked whinny, her body twisting as she tried to pull away. The boy held on, his fingers digging into the leather, his feet slipping in the mud. And then he saw it. A shadow, larger than anything he'd expected, moving through the trees with an unnatural grace. It was there and then gone, slipping between the trunks like smoke. The boy's breath caught, his mind racing to make sense of what he'd just seen. But there was no time to think. The shadow was moving again, circling them, its presence as undeniable as the storm itself. The boy's grip on the reins tightened, his other hand clutching the knife so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't know what was out there, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't alone. The boy's pulse raced as the shadow flickered between the trees, a presence that seemed to breathe with the storm itself. He kept his back against the horse, one hand still gripping the reins while the other held the knife. He wanted to run, wanted to pull the horse away and disappear into the darkness, but where would they go? There was nowhere to hide. The forest felt endless, and the storm made everything feel tighter, smaller, like the world had shrunk around them. The shadow was circling them, faster now, its movements almost too quick to follow. The boy caught glimpses of it in the flashes of lightning, a shape low to the ground but massive, its outline distorted by the storm. He felt the horse trembling against him, her fear feeding his own. He didn't dare move, barely dared to breathe. Whatever this thing was, it was waiting for him to make a mistake. The boy's mind raced, desperate for a plan. His grandfather's words echoed faintly in his head. Sometimes, fear is just a test. It's what you do with it that matters. But what could he do? He was just a kid, out here in the middle of nowhere, armed with nothing but a pocket knife and sheer determination. And determination wasn't going to stop whatever was stalking them. Then, without warning, the shadow darted closer. The boy barely had time to react before it disappeared again, melting into the darkness. The horse reared, nearly knocking him over, and he scrambled to keep hold of the reins. His voice cracked as he tried to calm her. "It's okay. It's okay." But it wasn't okay. Not even close. Another flash of lightning lit up the forest, and for a split second, the boy saw it clearly. The shadow wasn't just a shadow, it was a creature, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, its body low and sleek, like a predator sizing up its prey. It was close enough now that he could hear it breathing, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down his spine. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. It would only make things worse. He tightened his grip on the reins and whispered to the horse, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We have to move. Slowly. Don't run." The horse seemed to understand, or maybe she was too scared to do anything but follow his lead. Together, they began to inch forward, every step agonizingly slow. The boy kept his eyes on the trees, on the spaces between them where the creature might be hiding. His knuckles were white around the knife, his hand trembling but steady enough to hold its grip. The rain was easing now, though the wind still howled and tore through the branches above. The boy thought he could hear something else, something faint beneath the roar of the storm. It was a strange, rhythmic sound, almost like a voice, though not one he recognized. It came and went, blending with the wind, and every time he thought he could make out the words, it was gone again. The boy wasn't sure if he was imagining it. The storm, the fear, it was all too much. His mind felt stretched thin, his thoughts unraveling like loose threads. But the sound was there, just on the edge of his hearing, pulling at him, drawing him deeper into the woods. He wanted to ignore it, to focus on getting out, but the sound wouldn't let him go. It was almost like it was calling to him, beckoning him forward. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but the pull was stronger than his fear. The horse stopped suddenly, her ears flicking back. The boy froze, his heart pounding as he scanned the shadows. The creature was still out there, he could feel it, but now something else was watching them. A new noise broke through the storm, sharp and startling. It was a voice this time, unmistakably human, and it was calling out. The boy couldn't make out the words, but the tone was frantic, desperate, like someone was searching for him. He hesitated. It could be help. Someone else caught in the storm, someone who could lead him back to safety. But it could also be something else. A trap. A trick. He didn't know what to believe anymore. The voice came again, closer now, and the boy's chest tightened. He wanted to call out, but his throat felt dry, his voice trapped somewhere deep inside. The horse shifted beside him, her muscles taut and ready to bolt. Then, the creature moved again. It was faster this time, its shape darting between the trees with impossible speed. The boy's head snapped toward it, his grip tightening on the knife. The voice was still calling, growing louder, but he couldn't focus on it anymore. The creature was too close. It stopped suddenly, just at the edge of the light, and for the first time, the boy could see it clearly. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, its limbs long and unnaturally thin. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the lightning, and its mouth was filled with sharp, gleaming teeth. It wasn't like anything the boy had ever seen before, not in real life, not even in his nightmares. The boy's breath caught, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. The creature was watching him, its gaze unblinking, its body perfectly still. It was waiting, just like before, but this time it felt different. This time, it wasn't just circling. It was preparing to strike. The boy took a step back, pulling the horse with him. His legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment, but he forced himself to stay upright. He couldn't afford to fall. Not now. The creature tilted its head, its movements almost curious, and the boy felt a fresh wave of fear wash over him. It was toying with him, drawing this out, savoring the hunt. The voice called out again, louder and more urgent, but the boy barely heard it. All he could see was the creature, its glowing eyes locked onto his. The knife in his hand felt useless, like a toy, but it was all he had. He didn't know how this was going to end. He didn't know if he'd make it out of the forest, if he'd ever see his family again, if the horse would survive this. All he knew was that he couldn't give up. Not yet. Not ever. The storm roared around them, the wind and rain and thunder blending into a cacophony of chaos. The boy's heartbeat seemed to match the rhythm, a steady drumbeat in his ears, driving him forward. He took another step back, then another, his eyes never leaving the creature. And then, without warning, it lunged. The creature lunged with a speed that didn't seem possible, its dark form a blur as it closed the distance between them. The boy's instincts took over. He yanked the horse's reins and threw himself sideways, landing hard in the mud as the creature's claws slashed through the space where they'd just been. The horse reared, her shrill cry cutting through the storm. The boy scrambled to his feet, his hand clutching the knife so tightly it dug into his palm. The creature turned, its glowing eyes locking onto him again. For a moment, it hesitated, as if deciding which of them to pursue. "Go!" the boy shouted, his voice raw and desperate. He smacked the horse's flank, urging her to run. She hesitated for a heartbeat, torn between her fear and loyalty, before bolting into the darkness. The boy's heart sank as he watched her disappear, but relief flickered through his fear. At least she was safer now, away from this thing. But he wasn't. The creature turned its full attention to him, its body low and coiled, ready to strike again. The boy's breath came in short gasps, his chest tight with fear. He raised the knife, his hand shaking, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. The creature was too big, too fast, too powerful. The storm seemed to roar louder around them, the wind whipping through the trees, the rain pounding against the earth. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the creature's twisted form. Its eyes glinted, its teeth bared, and the boy could see the raw hunger in its expression. He took a step back, then another, his feet slipping in the mud. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. No escape, no help, no hope. The creature moved closer, its muscles rippling beneath its matted fur, and the boy knew he was out of time. Then, through the chaos, he heard the voice again. Closer now, louder, almost urgent. It cut through the storm like a lifeline, pulling his attention away from the creature for just a moment. "Over here!" the voice shouted. "Run this way!" The boy turned, his eyes searching the darkness, and for a split second, he saw a figure in the distance. They were waving their arms, their silhouette barely visible against the trees. He didn't know who they were or why they were here, but he didn't have a choice. He ran. His legs felt like lead, every step a struggle against the mud and rain, but he forced himself to keep moving. The creature let out a guttural snarl behind him, and he could feel it gaining on him, its breath hot on his heels. The boy's chest burned, his lungs screaming for air, but he didn't dare slow down. The figure in the distance moved, leading him toward a cluster of trees. "This way!" they shouted again, their voice steady and firm. The boy followed, his fear and desperation driving him forward. He could hear the creature behind him, its claws tearing through the underbrush, its snarls growing louder. He didn't look back. He couldn't. All he could do was run, his eyes fixed on the figure ahead, his mind focused on survival. The trees closed in around them, their branches weaving together like a canopy. The figure disappeared into the shadows, and for a moment, the boy thought he'd lost them. Panic surged through him, but then he saw it, a narrow opening between the trees, barely big enough for him to squeeze through. "Here!" the voice called, closer now. "Hurry!" The boy didn't think. He dove through the gap, the branches scraping against his arms and face, the mud slick beneath his hands. He landed hard on the other side, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The creature skidded to a stop at the edge of the opening, its massive form too large to follow. It let out a furious snarl, its glowing eyes burning with anger. The boy scrambled backward, his heart racing as the creature clawed at the gap, trying to force its way through. "Keep moving," the voice said, and the boy turned to see the figure standing a few feet away. They were cloaked in shadow, their features hidden, but their tone was calm, almost commanding. "It won't stay there for long." The boy nodded, his legs shaking as he pushed himself to his feet. He didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. He just followed the figure, their presence somehow steadying him, even as the storm raged around them. The creature let out another snarl, its claws tearing at the trees, and the boy knew it wouldn't give up easily. Whatever it was, whatever it wanted, it wasn't going to stop until it had him. The figure led him deeper into the forest, their steps quick and purposeful. The boy struggled to keep up, his exhaustion weighing him down, but he forced himself to keep going. He couldn't stop now. Finally, they reached a small clearing, the trees opening up just enough to reveal a rocky outcrop. The figure climbed onto the rocks, gesturing for the boy to follow. "Up here," they said. "It can't climb this." The boy hesitated, glancing back toward the trees. The creature's snarls were growing louder, closer, and he knew they didn't have much time. He scrambled onto the rocks, his hands slipping on the wet surface, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure helped him up, their grip strong and steady, and together they climbed to the top. The boy collapsed onto the flat surface, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The creature burst into the clearing below, its glowing eyes locking onto them. It let out a furious roar, its claws digging into the ground as it tried to follow. But the rocks were too steep, too slick, and it couldn't find a foothold. For the first time, the boy felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't safe yet, but for now, he had a chance. A chance to survive. A chance to fight. The figure sat beside him, their gaze fixed on the creature below. "It's not over yet," they said, their voice low and serious. "But you're stronger than you think. Remember that." The boy looked at them, his fear and exhaustion mixing with a newfound determination. He didn't know who they were or why they were helping him, but their words sparked something inside him. He wasn't done. Not yet. The boy stared at the stranger, still trying to catch his breath. The storm was easing slightly, but the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Below them, the creature paced at the base of the rocks, snarling and snapping at the air as if taunting them. Its eyes glowed brighter, reflecting the faint light of the storm, and its movements were more erratic now, as if it was growing impatient. "Why is it still here?" the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. His heart was pounding, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something worse. The stranger didn't answer at first. They were watching the creature with an intensity that made the boy uneasy. Their face was still hard to make out in the shadows, but their presence was calm, unnervingly so. Finally they spoke, their tone quiet but firm. "It's not after you." The boy blinked, his mind racing to make sense of the words. "What do you mean?" "It's been chasing me this whole time." The stranger turned to him, their expression unreadable. "It's after something else. Something you have. Think carefully. Did you bring anything with you? Something unusual, Something out of place? The boy frowned, his thoughts swirling. His backpack had been left behind at the riverbank when the storm first hit, so he had nothing on him but the knife and the clothes he was wearing. He shook his head, confused. No, I don't have anything. Just me. The stranger's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, they seemed to look straight through him, as if searching for something hidden. The boy shifted uncomfortably under their gaze, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the storm. Think again, the stranger said. Sometimes, we carry things we don't even know are there. Before the boy could respond, the creature below let out a deafening roar, its claws tearing at the base of the rocks. The boy flinched, gripping the slick surface beneath him as the ground seemed to vibrate with the creature's fury. The stranger stood, their movements deliberate and controlled. Stay here, they said, their voice steady despite the chaos. I'll be back. The boy's stomach dropped. What? You're leaving? You can't leave me here. But the stranger didn't respond. They stepped to the edge of the rocks, their silhouette sharp against the stormy sky, and began to climb down. The boy's protests caught in his throat as he watched them descend, their movements fluid and confident, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. The creature stopped pacing as soon as the stranger's feet touched the ground. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, its snarls fading into an eerie silence. The boy held his breath, his body frozen as he watched the two face each other. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature and the stranger stood motionless, like two predators sizing each other up. Then, the stranger raised their hand, and the boy saw something glint in the faint light, a small, metallic object clutched tightly in their palm. The creature let out a low growl, its body tensing as it prepared to lunge. The boy's heart felt like it was going to explode. He wanted to shout, to warn the stranger, but his voice wouldn't come. The stranger didn't flinch. They stepped closer to the creature, their movements deliberate and measured. The boy couldn't see their face, but he could feel the weight of their presence, the quiet authority in the way they carried themselves. Then, without warning, the creature lunged. It was faster than anything the boy had ever seen, its massive form a blur as it closed the distance. The stranger didn't move, didn't even raise the object in their hand. They just stood there, calm and unshaken, as the creature bore down on them. The boy's scream caught in his throat as the creature reached the stranger, but then something impossible happened. The storm seemed to shift, the wind and rain swirling around them in a vortex of chaos. The metallic object in the stranger's hand began to glow, emitting a soft, pulsing light that grew brighter with each passing second. The creature skidded to a halt, its snarls turning into a guttural whine as it backed away, its glowing eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear. The boy's mind raced, struggling to process what he was seeing. The light from the object spread outward, illuminating the clearing in a way that felt unnatural, otherworldly. The creature recoiled, its massive body trembling as if the light was burning it. The strangers stepped forward, their voice calm but firm. You don't belong here, they said, their words carrying an authority that made the boy shiver. Go back to where you came from. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting roar, its body convulsing as the light engulfed it. Then, with a blinding flash, it disappeared, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The boy stared, his mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. The stranger turned back to him, their face still hidden in shadow, and began climbing back up the rocks. When they reached the top, they knelt beside the boy, their expression unreadable. We're not safe yet, they said quietly. There's more to this storm than you know. The boy's throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. What? What just happened? What was that thing? The stranger hesitated, their gaze distant. Not everything in this world is what it seems, they said. And some things are drawn to people like you. The boy frowned, confusion and fear knotting in his chest. People like me? I don't understand. You will, the stranger said, their voice soft but certain. But first, we need to find your horse. And we need to leave this place. Now. The boy nodded, his legs trembling as he stood. He didn't know who this stranger was, or what they meant by their cryptic words, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. Not yet. And somehow, he was at the center of it all. The boy followed the stranger through the forest, his legs shaky but driven by a strange determination. The storm had calmed, leaving behind an eerie quiet that pressed down on him like a weight. The trees loomed taller in the faint light, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, and the path ahead seemed to shift and narrow, as if the forest itself didn't want them there. "Where are we going?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. He couldn't shake the image of the creature vanishing into that impossible light. He couldn't stop thinking about the stranger's words, "people like you." The stranger didn't look back. "We need to find your horse," they said simply. "She's the key to ending this." The boy frowned. "How?" "She's just a horse. What does she have to do with any of this?" The stranger's pace quickened, their voice low and clipped. "She's not just a horse. She's carrying something that doesn't belong in this world." The boy's stomach twisted. He thought about the saddlebag he'd packed that morning, stuffed with nothing but some snacks, a map, and a few supplies. Nothing unusual. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the stranger's words hung heavy in the air, and he couldn't deny the growing unease gnawing at him. The forest thinned out suddenly, opening into a clearing bathed in pale moonlight. There, standing near the edge of the tree line, was his horse. Relief surged through him, and he broke into a run, calling out her name. She lifted her head, her ears flicking toward him, but something about her stance made him falter. She wasn't alone. Standing a few feet away was another figure, cloaked in shadow. They turned slowly as the boy approached, and his heart sank. The figure looked human mostly, but there was something off. Their movements were too smooth, their features too sharp, their eyes glinting with an unnatural light that sent a shiver down his spine. "You've brought it this far," the figure said, their voice smooth and unsettling. "That's all we needed." The boy stopped in his tracks, his pulse racing. "What? What are you talking about? Who are you?" The stranger stepped forward, positioning themselves between the boy and the figure. Their presence was steady, but there was a tension in their stance, a readiness that made the boy's chest tighten. "You don't belong here," the stranger said, their tone sharp. "This ends now." The figure tilted their head, a faint smile playing at the corners of their mouth. "You think you can stop this? It's already begun." The boy brought it with him, he carried it all this way without even knowing. The boy's throat tightened. "What are you talking about? I didn't bring anything." The figure's smile widened. "Didn't you? Look in the saddlebag." The boy hesitated, his hands trembling as he moved toward the horse. She whinnied softly, her breath warm against his cheek as he reached for the bag. His fingers fumbled with the straps, his heart pounding as he opened it. Inside, nestled among the supplies, was something he didn't recognize. A small, intricately carved object that seemed to pulse faintly with its own light. It was smooth and cold to the touch, its surface etched with patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them too long. He pulled it out, holding it up to the faint light, and his stomach dropped. He had no memory of putting it there. "What? What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger didn't take their eyes off the figure. "It's a tether," they said. "A doorway between worlds. And they'd been using you to bring it here." The boy's hands shook as he stared at the object. "I didn't know. I didn't." "It doesn't matter," the stranger interrupted. "What matters is what you do now." The figure stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. You can't destroy it, they said, their voice calm. It's part of you now. Part of this world. And if you try to break it. They trailed off, their smile twisting into something darker. Well, let's just say the consequences would be interesting. The boy looked at the stranger, panic rising in his chest. What do I do? How do I stop this? The stranger finally turned to him, their expression grave. You have to choose, they said. Destroy it, and risk tearing open something we can't close. Or keep it, and let it draw more of those things into our world. The boy's mind raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The object in his hands seemed to pulse faster, its light growing brighter, and the air around them grew heavy with a strange energy. The figure stepped closer, their smile fading into something colder. You don't understand what you're holding, they said. That's not just a tether, it's a seed. And it's already growing. The boy's breath caught. He could feel it now, a faint warmth spreading through his hands, up his arms, as if the object was alive. He looked at the stranger, desperation in his eyes. What if I don't do anything? What if I just leave it here? The stranger's gaze hardened. Then it will grow. Slowly at first, but it won't stop. And by the time you realize what it's become, it'll be too late. The boy's grip tightened on the object, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what was right. All he knew was that the storm, the creature, the figure, they were all connected to this, to him. And somehow, he was the only one who could stop it. He looked at the stranger, then at the figure, and finally at the object in his hands. The light was almost blinding now, its warmth spreading through his entire body. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. Then, without a word, he made his choice. The light exploded outward, consuming everything in its path. The boy felt the ground shift beneath him, the air crackling with energy as the world seemed to split apart. He heard the stranger shout something, their voice lost in the chaos, and the figure's laughter echoed in his ears as the light swallowed them all. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The boy opened his eyes, his body trembling. The clearing was empty now, the storm gone, the forest silent. The object was gone too, its light extinguished, leaving behind only a faint warmth in his hands. The stranger was beside him, their expression tired but calm. You did it, they said quietly. The boy looked around, his heart still racing. What? What happens now? The stranger hesitated, their gaze distant. That depends, they said. The tether is gone, but the scar it left. That might take longer to heal. The boy frowned, confusion and fear swirling in his chest. What do you mean? The stranger didn't answer. They turned and walked toward the edge of the clearing, their silhouette fading into the shadows. And as the boy stood there, the faint echo of the figure's laughter still lingering in the air, he realized something. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.